Namaskar. A warm welcome to World News and Indian Perspective on All India Radio. This is R.S. Raghu and with me is Renuka, bringing glimpses of the major developments of the day from across the globe. Over the next half an hour, we shall bring you the latest from the world of politics, economy, sports, entertainment and more. The headlines. Prime Minister Narendra Modi reviews COVID-19 situation in the country. Indian Army establishes COVID Management Cell to coordinate assistance to civil authority. United States supports waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines. SpaceX Starship SN-15 lands safely in a successful test flight. China suspends all activities with Australia under the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue Framework. Sputnik V launches single-dose coronavirus vaccine. And in football, Chelsea beat Real Madrid to set up an all-English UEFA Champions League final against Manchester City. As the number of the COVID cases are on the rise again, we appeal to our listeners not to lower the guard, follow all the precautions and all those above 18 years to get vaccinated without any hesitation. Stay safe and protected by following these 3 simple steps. Wear a face mask, maintain 2 gaz ki duri for social distancing, and focus on hand and face hygiene. Now the news in detail. Prime Minister Narendra Modi on Tuesday undertook a comprehensive review of the COVID-19 related situation in the country. He was given a detailed picture on the COVID outbreak in various states and districts. He was informed about the 12 states which have more than 1 lakh active cases. The Prime Minister was also apprised about the districts with high disease burden. Mr. Modi was briefed about the ramping up of healthcare infrastructure by the states. He directed that states should be given help and guidance about leading indicators to ramp up healthcare infrastructure. The need to ensure quick and holistic containment measures were also discussed. The Prime Minister noted that an advisory was sent to the states to identify districts of concern. These districts have a case positivity rate of 10% or more, and bed occupancy is more than 60% on either oxygen-supported or ICU beds. Mr. Modi also reviewed the availability of medicines. He was briefed about the rapid augmenting of production of medicines, including remdesivir. He also reviewed the progress on vaccination and the roadmap for scaling up production of vaccines in the next month. He was informed that around 17.7 crore vaccines have been supplied to the states. The Prime Minister also reviewed the state-wise trends on vaccine wastage. He was briefed that around 31% of the eligible population over the age of 45 has been given at least 1 dose. Mr. Modi spoke about the need to sensitize states that the speed of vaccination does not come down. Union Ministers Rajnath Singh, Amit Shah, Nirmala Sitharaman, Dr. Harshvardhan, Piyush Goyal, Mansukh Mandavia and other ministers and top officials were present in the meeting. Indian Army has established a COVID Management Cell to coordinate assistance to civil authority. The cell has been under a Director General rank officer which reports directly to the Vice Chief of Army Staff. This will bring in greater efficiency in coordinating real-time responses to address exponential rise in COVID cases across the country, including Delhi. Assistance to civil administration in Delhi is already being provided in the form of testing, admissions in military hospitals, and transportation of critical medical equipment. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has lauded the armed forces for their services being rendered during this pandemic. Responding to Defence Minister Rajnath Singh's tweet, Mr. Modi said, Jal, Thal and Nab. India's armed forces have left no stone unturned in strengthening the fight against COVID-19. The Defence Minister has said that along with the efforts put together by the scientific community, health professionals, civil administration, the armed forces too have pitched in this battle against an invisible yet deadly enemy, and they are engaged to help mitigate the sufferings of the people.
India has administered over 16 crore 25 lakh COVID-19 vaccine doses in the country so far. The Union Health Ministry said that more than 19 lakh 55,000 beneficiaries have been inoculated with COVID-19 vaccine doses in the last 24 hours. Meanwhile, a total number of 4,12,262 new cases have been reported in the country in the past 24 hours, taking the cumulative positive cases to over 2 crore 10 lakh. The Health Ministry said 3,980 deaths have also been reported during the last 24 hours, taking the toll to over 2,30,000 across the country. The country's COVID-19 recovery rate is at 81.99%, with a recovery of more than 3,29,000 patients in the last 24 hours. Presently, the total number of active cases in the country is over 35,66,000, which comprises 16.92% of the total positive cases. Now let's take a look at the coronavirus updates from around the world. Sputnik V has claimed to have launched a single-dose coronavirus vaccine called Sputnik Light. In a tweet, the company said that the first shot vaccine has 80% efficacy. The Turkish government has allowed foreign tourists to enter the country without undergoing the 2.5-week lockdown that is in place for residents. Those arriving in the country must produce negative COVID-19 tests. Israel's Green Pass for people who have been vaccinated against or recovered from COVID-19 will be extended until the end of the year. The Green Pass allows holders to live without major restrictions. The Japanese government is looking at an extension of the state of emergency in Tokyo and other areas, casting doubt over the fate of the Tokyo Olympics less than 3 months before they are set to begin. Meanwhile, the United Nations in Myanmar reiterated its call for health workers, health facilities and patients in the country to be protected. In a statement, the UN warned of the impact on public health, including the COVID-19 response, from attacks on medical personnel and facilities. According to the World Health Organization (WHO) global surveillance system, since the beginning of February, there have been 158 reported attacks on healthcare, resulting in 11 deaths and 51 injuries. This is All India Radio giving you the world news.
Three steps to stay protected and stay safe from COVID-19. Wear face mask, 2 gaz ki duri, to maintain social distancing, maintain hand and face hygiene.
In a major decision, U.S. President Joe Biden on Wednesday threw his support behind waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines. In remarks to reporters, he voiced his support for the waiver, which is a sharp reversal of the previous U.S. position. A statement from the External Affairs Ministry of India said that during a recent phone call with the US President Biden, Prime Minister Modi had informed him about India's initiative at the WTO, which was aimed at the benefit of humanity. India welcomed the statement of the US government of 5th May announcing their support for this initiative. The statement added that India is hopeful that with a consensus-based approach, the waiver can be approved quickly at the WTO. The waiver is an important step for enabling rapid scaling up of manufacture and timely availability of affordable COVID-19 vaccines and essential medical products. U.S. President's top trade negotiator, Katherine Tai, also issued a statement and backed negotiations at the World Trade Organization. Tai said that the extraordinary circumstances of the COVID-19 pandemic call for extraordinary measures. The head of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, called Biden's move a monumental moment in the fight against COVID-19 on Twitter and said it reflected the wisdom and moral leadership of the United States. The move is in line with the joint proposal forwarded to the WTO by India and South Africa in October 2020 at the WTO's TRIPS Council. India and South Africa proposed that the WTO waive the application of certain provisions of the TRIPS agreement for the duration of the pandemic with a view to facilitating wider access to technologies necessary for the production of vaccines and medicines. Meanwhile, China on Thursday said that it is ready to discuss a proposal related to the temporary waiver of COVID-19 vaccine patents within WTO. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar on Wednesday participated virtually in the G7 Foreign Ministers meeting. India was invited as a guest country to the group's first in-person meeting since the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic. In today's Hotspots section, we are bringing you a discussion on the G7 meeting, its importance and expectations.
The United Kingdom has invited India to attend the G7 summit as a special guest. This summit is scheduled to be held in Cornwall in England. Joining us to examine why India's presence at these deliberations of the group of 7 most wealthy nations of the world is important. Now, there are suggestions that this invitation to India this time is an acknowledgement of the fact that despite the current state of the Indian economy, the world expects India to bounce back. Anil, would you agree with that assessment?
The world expects India to bounce back, and also the fact that India has been invited to the G7 Leaders Summit in 2021 because of the fact that despite the 46% of global GDP coming from the G7 countries and the G7 making up 1/10 of the world population, they see India as very important to the agenda for the G7 Leaders Summit in 2021. If you look at the agenda which is on the table for them is leading the global recovery from the coronavirus while strengthening resilience against future pandemics. That's the first one. Second item on the agenda is promoting future prosperity by championing free and fair trade. Thirdly, tackling climate change and preserving the planet's biodiversity. And finally, championing global shared values. In all these, India has a major role to play. And that's also the reason why we see an Indian presence at the current Foreign and Development Ministers meeting. Besides the European Union, you also have the presence of India, Australia, South Korea, and South Africa. Because all these countries are seen as important for the G7 agenda going forward this year, which will be held in June 2021 in Cornwall.
As you rightly said, Anil, Australia, South Korea, and South Africa are also among the other nations specially invited to attend. Now, it's fairly clear that coordinating a global response to the pandemic will be an important part of their agenda this time. Can we expect to see some real-time decisions taken by these ministers on cooperation, on vaccines, for example, or IPRs or something like that?
Let's begin by going back to the point about the invitation to India, which we referred to. I think the invitation of India was also extended by Donald Trump, who would have hosted the summit in 2020, and he had also invited Prime Minister Modi. Of course, due to the pandemic, that meeting never took place. But like President Trump, Boris Johnson is also keen to expand membership of the G7, and that's why he's also invited Australia and South Korea's prime ministers to Cornwall, along with the Indian Prime Minister. And of course, he's hoping that the international community has been potential as a huge market and is paying a lot of attention to India. And we would also recall that successive Indian prime ministers had also been to the G7 meetings, as many as 5 G7 summits earlier. It was called the G8 before. So that happened in 2005 in UK, in 2006 in Russia, 2007 in Germany, in 2008 in Japan, and 2009 in Italy. And of course, the world expected more out of India as far as rapid economic growth is concerned, but there's no denying its huge potential and its demographic credentials, which cannot be ignored. Here again, attending this meeting by the Indian Prime Minister will push India's concerns, and Prime Minister Modi will have a chance to articulate our own ideas for a post-COVID world before the leaders of the world's most advanced nations. So that's a given. You rightly talked about the current situation when we are also looking at vaccine cooperation and how to tackle the pandemic issue which is facing the world. It just so happens that at this point in time, India is facing a second wave. But India has also been in the forefront of vaccine production across the world and seen as a very important country in terms of vaccine production and distribution, etc., etc. I'm sure at this development foreign ministers meeting, the discussion would focus upon how India should tackle its current situation and, of course, the future of vaccine production, which is meant for the rest of the world as well. So this is an ideal opportunity to look at the foreign aid, etc., which is flowed in from about 40 countries, given the current second wave in India. At the same time, India's own capabilities of ramping up production, pulling out the vaccination in its own country and also in other countries.
Again, as you rightly pointed out, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has acknowledged that India is the pharmacy of the world and already supplies approximately 50% of the world's vaccines. And obviously, they're planning to work more closely together given the situation globally at the moment where, say, the African continent haven't even begun to get the vaccine. Now, the G7, which comprises United States, Canada, Japan, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, also the countries which are India's strategic partners individually. So this in-person meeting that External Affairs Minister will have with his counterparts in all of these countries, are they just going to be like forerunner for what will happen at the summit meeting in June? Or does this kind of in-person meeting help to further develop, bilateral and multilateral relations?
There is some amount of overlap in the agendas of the Foreign and Development Ministers meeting and the G7 Leaders Summit, which is going to come up in June in Cornwall this year. So if you look at the agenda, which we had outlined earlier for the summit, that's focused on four things, which is global recovery from the virus and strengthening resilience against future pandemics, also promoting future prosperity through free and fair trade. Thirdly, the climate change issue and preserving the planet's biodiversity. And finally, championing global shared values. Now, at this meeting that we are looking at right now, it's quite clear that there are similar agenda items which the foreign and development ministers are looking at. Of course, they're looking at the pandemic situation and how to tackle the current situation and going forward, how to build towards the decisions to be taken at the summit in this regard. Secondly, some discussion would definitely take place on climate change and what should happen at the summit by way of important decisions which need to be taken. But more importantly, I think it's also looking at the rules-based international system. And in terms of that, we are focused on a lot of current issues which are on the plate. So, for example, to the United Kingdom and the United States, issue of Ukraine, as far as Russia is concerned, is important. In Asia, the coup in Myanmar is important. In Asia, also the rules-based international system in the South China Sea and the Chinese challenge is very important. In terms of climate, you have focus on women in particular, on the role of women going forward. And I think there is some agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States already in terms of setting aside some funds for this purpose so that this decision could be taken up at the G7 Leaders Summit in June. That's also a topic for discussion between the foreign and development ministers.
All four of the members of the quadrilateral of four countries, Australia, India, United States and Japan, are part of the foreign ministers of all four are going to be present in London at this point of time. Since the last summit quad happened just last month, the leaders agreed to expand their collaboration to include this vaccine, ameliorating human suffering through the spread of vaccines and so on. Now, when External Affairs Minister Jaishankar today met Tony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, would this whole issue of vaccine collaboration and so on have come up? Because at this point, this is probably the most glaring problem that the world is facing.
The meeting which took place between Jaishankar and Mr. Blinken, from what's come out of that meeting, we've had a discussion on expanding the vaccine production in India, looking at resilient and reliable supply chains in this regard, but also the support by the United States to India in the current situation, especially with regard to oxygen supplies, remdesivir and other medicines. And finally, the situation in the Indo-Pacific region, and in that context, Myanmar, what the United Nations can do, United Nations Security Council in particular, and also climate change. So these were the broad issues that were discussed. Now, if you look at the agenda of the Quad during that summit meeting, we had three main focus areas. One is vaccine production in India and distribution in the Indo-Pacific. Secondly, strengthening the resilient supply chains and with focus on new technologies. And thirdly, climate change. So again, you see a overlap of these topics. Obviously, this meeting of the foreign and development ministers is going to be extremely important in taking forward this agenda, which sort of meshes in with the objectives of the Quad as far as Indo-Pacific is concerned, but also in terms of the wider world, where vaccine, as you rightly pointed out, and reliable supply chains have become center stage and very important. In all this, India will play a very important role.
Now, this particular week and this whole G7 summit, the United Kingdom has sort of said that this is a time for chance for the West to reassert its influence in all issues related not just to the coronavirus recovery and the global economic situation, but also climate change and so on. So these problems that they are trying to assert some kind of ascendance over, shall we say, countries like Russia and China. How uncomfortable would that make a country like, say, India feel in these circumstances?
As we've seen in the past, agenda of the G7 is deliberated upon by all countries who are present, including the G7 plus the invitees, but it is not necessary that all of them are on the same page as far as the agenda items are concerned. Traditionally, what happens is that everyone puts forward their point of view, and the G7 then tries to reach a consensus on the way forward with cooperation of all who are around the table. In this case, we've seen statements from the United Kingdom and Prime Minister Boris Johnson in particular, because he's invited the leaders from India, Australia and South Korea to attend as guest countries. It is with a specific purpose to deepen the expertise and the experience around the table on items on the agenda which we have before us. Now, his ambition is, of course, to use the G7 to intensify cooperation between the world's democratic and technologically advanced nations. So between them, the 10 leaders represent over 60% of the people living in democracies around the world. But at the same time, they play a very important role today in terms of being a catalyst for decisive international action to tackle the greatest challenges that we face. And of course, from the point of view of the UK and USA, the challenge from Russia and China are foremost on their minds. India looks at so-called challenge from Russia as different from the way the United Kingdom would look at it. And obviously, we look at world issues from a different perspective also. So I think the G7 will need to come to an agreement on the most pressing issues. And in my view, they will ultimately boil down to the issues like vaccine development and distribution, climate change, and also building the resilient supply chains. On the political issues, there are always shades of differences which will persist. And as is usual in the previous summit meetings, all the countries who are participating will, of course, express their own views. But what will prevail is the consensus.
It's interesting in this case that Britain has been talking, and particularly Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been talking a lot about the leading democracies of the world and them coming to try and establish a certain, as you said, rules-based order. So can we expect some kind of more definitive response to the situation in Myanmar, for example? For India, certainly that is an important part of the agenda.
So there is no doubt that all countries who will be participating at the G7, at the Foreign Development Ministers meeting, as well as at the summit, obviously want democracy to be restored in Myanmar. There is no difference on that. But on that issue, there is a difference in opinion. Because if you look at the countries in Asia, and especially countries like India, which are bordering Myanmar, and Myanmar is a very important neighbor of India, would try to make sure that all players in Myanmar are taken into account if a solution has to be found. And we've seen repeatedly that anything which is being imposed from outside has not worked in Myanmar. The ASEAN recently met and took the lead in this regard, and they came to the same conclusion. So I think everyone who's a player in Myanmar today, including the military, will have to find a solution to this together.
Anil, thank you so very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
China's National Development and Reform Commission has indefinitely suspended all activities under the framework of the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue, exacerbating the already strained diplomatic ties between Beijing and Canberra. The dialogue is jointly held by China's top economic planner, the National Development and Reform Commission (NDRC), and relevant ministries of the Australian government. The NDRC said in a statement on its website on Thursday, the decision was made based on the current attitude of the Australian Australian Commonwealth Government toward China-Australia cooperation. According to Beijing, the Australia government's policy toward China constitutes ideological discrimination and reflects a Cold War mindset. According to media reports, Australia has described China's decision to suspend economic talks as disappointing. China's decision to suspend the economic dialogue comes after the Australian government last month scrapped a Belt and Road deal between Beijing and the state of Victoria, and last week Canberra said that a Chinese company's 99-year lease on Darwin Port was under review. SpaceX achieved the first successful touchdown of its prototype Starship rocket during the latest test flight of the next-generation launch vehicle in South Texas on Wednesday. The Starship SN-15 achieved this after 4 previous landing attempts ended in explosions. The feat marked a key milestone for the private rocket company of Elon Musk in its development of a reusable heavy-lift launch vehicle to eventually carry astronauts and large cargo payloads to the Moon and Mars. The Starship SN-15 blasted off from the SpaceX launch site in Boca Chica, Texas, along the Gulf Coast.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi will participate in the meeting of the European Council on 8th of this month as a special invitee. The India-EU leaders meeting is hosted by Prime Minister of Portugal, Antonio Costa. Portugal currently holds the presidency of the Council of European Union. Prime Minister Modi will participate in the meeting along with the heads of state or government of all the 27 EU member states. External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, held bilateral foreign ministers meeting with British counterpart Dominic Raab today. Both leaders focused on responsibility for implementing the 2030 roadmap. In a tweet, Dr. Jaishankar exuded confidence that early progress will be seen on many fronts. They also explored strategic convergences across regions and discussed the Indo-Pacific global health challenges and UN cooperation in some detail.
Moving on to sports, Chelsea defeated Real Madrid to set up an All-English Champions League final against Manchester City on Wednesday. Manchester City had beaten Paris Saint-Germain 2-0 in the second leg of their semi-final on Tuesday to seal a 4-1 aggregate victory. It will be the second All-English final in 3 seasons after Liverpool beat Tottenham 2-0 in 2019. In Madrid Open tennis, Spain's Rafael Nadal spoiled Carlos Alcaraz's 18th birthday bash as he moved into the third round of Madrid Open with a 6-1, 6-2 victory on Wednesday. In the women's section, top seed Ashley Barty underlined her dominance of the tour with a 6-1, 3-6, 6-3 win over number 9 seed Petra Kvitova in 1 hour and 48 minutes to reach her first Madrid Open semi-final. The Australian will face wildcard Paula Badosa in the semis.
Now let us take a look at the major developments around the world as reported in the foreign press. The Telegraph reported that UK and French military ships were sent to Jersey as fishing row intensified. New York Times writes that Americans have entered a new hopeful phase of the pandemic as coronavirus cases and deaths have dipped. The Himalayan Times reports that Kathmandu Valley observed a record high coronavirus infection count with cases nearing 4,000 on Thursday. The Guardian writes that killer whales were spotted near Cornwall coast in a rare UK sighting. A quick look at the headlines once again. Prime Minister Narendra Modi reviews COVID-19 situation in the country. Indian Army establishes COVID management cell to coordinate assistance to civil authorities. United States supports waiving intellectual property rights for COVID-19 vaccines. SpaceX Starship SN-15 lands safely in a successful test flight. China suspends all activities with Australia under the China-Australia Strategic Economic Dialogue Framework. Sputnik V launches single-dose coronavirus vaccine. And in football, Chelsea beat Real Madrid to set up an all-English UEFA Champions League final against Manchester City. India is celebrating the 151st birth anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi. Before we end, let us listen to his favorite bhajan, Vaishnav Jan, by artists from Bahrain. Vaishnav Jan And with that, we end this bulletin. We'll be back at the same time tomorrow with the next edition of World News.